In the beginning there were no gods, only storms, fire, and fear. Humanity lived beneath a vast, indifferent sky. The sun burned, the rivers rose, the ground shook, and people had no answers. Out of that fear came stories, voices given to thunder, names given to the stars. We called them gods. We built fires to please them, sacrifices to calm them, temples to house them. But what began as devotion slowly became something else. A system of power, a weapon, and the world's first great conspiracy. When the first civilizations rose in the Fertile Crescent, along the rivers of Mesopotamia, the gods were not distant or abstract. They lived inside cities, in temples built like mountains. Every city had its god. Ur had Nana, the moon deity. Babylon had Marduk. Uruk had Inanna, the goddess of love and war. These were not private beliefs, they were declarations of sovereignty. Whoever ruled the temple ruled the city. Whoever spoke for the gods commanded the people. The priests of Sumer were not humble servants of heaven. They were accountants, engineers, and politicians. The ziggurats, those giant stepped pyramids that pierced the clouds, were not just monuments. They were banks. Grain, silver, and livestock were stored in temple complexes under priestly control. The temple economy became the heart of civilization. Religion became bureaucracy. Worship became taxation. Every offering to the gods was also an offering to their priests. And soon, the invisible hand of the divine became the most effective form of control ever devised. You didn't need an army to rule the masses. You only needed faith. The people obeyed because they believed the gods were watching. In ancient Mesopotamia, kings began to merge with priests, claiming divine bloodlines. Power no longer came from might, it came from heaven. To question the ruler was to question the cosmic order itself. The king's will was law because his law was the god's will. This was the first political invention disguised as religion, divine legitimacy. The gods were no longer the creators of the world. They were the justification for who controlled it. From Sumer to Akkad, the pantheons multiplied, but so did their rivalries. When empires clashed, the gods clashed with them. Conquest became a cosmic contest. If your army won, your god was stronger. The victory of one kingdom meant the death of another's deity. Temples were looted not for gold, but for symbols. Statues of rival gods were carried away as prisoners of war, trophies of spiritual domination. In Babylon, priests of Marduk elevated their god above all others. In Egypt, the priests of Amun declared that all creation flowed from their temple. Every religion began to claim universal truth. The battle for heaven became the blueprint for empire. By 2500 BCE, the priesthoods had grown more powerful than kings. They owned land, managed trade, dictated laws, and even crowned rulers. Their gods had become invisible governments. Religion was no longer a private act of wonder. It was public infrastructure, propaganda, and espionage. The temple recorded every debt, every birth, every oath. Writing itself, the first cuneiform tablets, began as records of temple transactions. Civilization was born in the service of the gods, but the gods were tools of civilization. When Hammurabi of Babylon carved his laws into stone, he didn't claim to have written them himself. He said they came directly from Shamash, the god of justice, who handed him the tablets in divine light. It was a master stroke of power. His laws weren't his. They were eternal. To disobey them was to disobey the universe. The people didn't argue with Hammurabi. They prayed to him. Egypt took this idea further than anyone. There, the pharaoh wasn't a servant of the gods. He was a god. The divine and the human merged completely. His word was creation. His image was eternity. The temples of Thebes and Heliopolis were not just places of worship. They were centers of global communication. Scribes tracked floods, harvests, and stars, turning astronomy into theology. The Nile's rhythm was explained as the heartbeat of a god. When the river rose, it is proof of divine order. When it didn't, the people begged for forgiveness. The priests of Amun held such power that they could decide who lived and who ruled. They claimed to speak directly with the gods through ritual, but ritual was politics disguised as mystery. Every sacrifice, every chant, every myth reinforced a single message. The world had a hierarchy, and heaven approved it. As civilizations grew, so did their divine rivalries. Egypt's Amun fought Babylon's Marduk for supremacy. The Canaanite Baal challenged both. Gods were exported like weapons, traded through marriage, war, and diplomacy. When one empire conquered another, it didn't destroy the enemy's faith. It absorbed it, reshaping their gods into servants of the victors. Babylon turned Sumer's Enlil into Marduk's subordinate. Egypt blended foreign gods into its pantheon to neutralize their power. Theology became geopolitics. Behind the myths, a new idea was forming, that whoever controlled the story of creation could control everything created by it. By 1500 BCE, religious texts had become national manifestos. In Babylon's Enuma Elish, Marduk slays the goddess Tiamat, carves her body into the sky and earth, and declares himself the ruler of gods and men. It's not just a myth, it's political theater. The story legitimizes Babylon's dominance over all other cities. The gods themselves become symbols of empire. And as these empires expanded, a darker current began to flow beneath the surface, the idea that only one version of the divine could exist. Monopolies of belief, cosmic propaganda. In Egypt, this tension exploded under a single man, Akhenaten. Around 1350 BCE, this pharaoh did something no ruler had ever dared. He declared that all gods except one were false. He closed temples, erased names, and built a new capital in the desert dedicated to Aten, the sun disk. For the first time in history, monotheism was born, the worship of a single universal God. Akhenaten didn't just change religion, he changed power itself. In a world of many gods, authority could be negotiated, but one God meant one truth, and one ruler to represent it. The old priesthoods were furious. For centuries they had been the mediators between gods and people. Now the pharaoh had cut them out completely. He was no longer just divine. He was absolute. But Akhenaten's revolution was short-lived. After his death, the priests of Amun returned with vengeance. They destroyed his monuments, erased his name, and buried his religion under centuries of sand. The god Aten was forgotten. The first monotheist became history's first heretic. Yet the seed he planted didn't die. Because somewhere in the deserts to the northeast, among the tribes of Canaan, another people were beginning to dream of one God, not of the sun, but of destiny itself. They would call him Yahweh, and their idea would ignite the ancient world like fire. What began as a battle between temples would soon become a war of worlds, fought not for land, but for truth itself. In the next part, we follow how monotheism emerged from exile, revolution, and survival, and how it turned faith into the most powerful empire of all, belief. It began in exile. Around the 6th century BCE, a conquered people sat by the rivers of Babylon and asked the question that would change the world. If our God is real, why did he let us lose? The Israelites had been taken from their homeland, Jerusalem burned, their temple destroyed. They were captives in the greatest city the world had ever seen. Babylon, with its towering ziggurats and golden idols, its streets lined with statues of gods older than their nation. Every empire before had fallen to the same logic. When your city falls, your gods die with it. But this time was different. In captivity, the Israelites did not abandon their God. They redefined him. The Babylonians worshipped Marduk, the supreme creator who brought order out of chaos. The Israelites worshipped Yahweh, who now became something greater, not just their tribal protector, but the God of all creation. Every other deity was a false reflection, a distortion of the one true power. Defeat was not proof of his weakness. It was punishment for their disobedience. In that act of reinterpretation, the greatest transformation in religious history took place. God ceased to be one among many and became the only one. The scribes of Babylon began to write and rewrite their history. Myths that had once been shared with their neighbors were edited, purified, recast into a new narrative. The flood story of Gilgamesh became the story of Noah. The Babylonian creation epic in which Marduk slays the chaos serpent became the Genesis account, where Yahweh speaks creation into being by word alone. In place of a war between gods, there was only one voice: "Let there be light." It was the birth of monotheism, not as philosophy, but as survival. Out of exile came identity. Out of defeat came destiny. The Israelites built a new kind of faith, portable, abstract, and unbreakable. Their God didn't need temples or idols. He existed everywhere, invisible, untouchable, beyond form. This was a God no conqueror could capture. But every revelation comes with a price. When truth becomes absolute, every other belief becomes heresy. What began as resilience slowly became exclusivity. The chosen people's covenant with Yahweh separated them from the rest of humanity. Their laws, their rituals, their identity, all became expressions of divine difference. Other nations didn't just have different gods, they had false gods. To worship them was not just wrong, it was rebellion against truth itself. For the first time, faith became ideological. The battlefield was no longer physical land, but the soul. The war of gods had turned inward, into a war of belief. Around the same time, far to the east, another prophet was asking similar questions. A Persian priest named Zarathustra, known later as Zoroaster. He lived in a land ruled by fire and shadow, a kingdom divided by violence and ritual. He preached that the world was not ruled by many gods, but by two forces, one of truth and light, Ahura Mazda, and one of darkness and deceit, Angra Mainyu. Humanity stood between them, free to choose which side to serve. It was the first dualism, a cosmic moral war. Good and evil were no longer just stories, they were metaphysical laws. The universe itself was a battlefield between light and shadow. Zoroaster's vision would shape not only Persia, but every religion that followed. From it came angels and demons, heaven and hell, apocalypse and judgment. Under the Persian Empire, this theology became state doctrine. The emperor ruled as the defender of light. Conquest was purification. The empire's wars became holy. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he freed the Jewish exiles, not as a gesture of mercy, but as an act of divine policy. Yahweh and Ahura Mazda had become allies in order, truth, and empire. The idea of one God, or one truth, was no longer a local revelation. It was a political technology. From that moment onward, religion became the software of empire. When Persia fell to Alexander, its faith scattered but did not die. Its moral dualism seeped westward into Greece, into Rome, into the philosophies that would later merge with Christianity. The concept of cosmic war, good versus evil, truth versus falsehood, became the invisible script behind world history. Meanwhile, back in Judea, the return from exile did not bring peace. The people rebuilt their temple, but not their unity. Empires came and went, Persians, Greeks, Romans, each demanding tribute to their own gods. Each time, rebellion followed. The priesthood fractured. Some believed holiness came from ritual purity, others from political revolt, others from retreating into isolation. Religion had become not only identity but resistance, the soul's weapon against empire. Then, around the 1st century BCE, a new vision emerged, a fusion of Hebrew prophecy, Persian dualism, and Greek metaphysics. A man named Jesus of Nazareth preached of a kingdom not of this world, where love triumphed over law and forgiveness replaced vengeance. His message was simple, but the world it entered was anything but. The Roman Empire ruled with an iron hand, its gods now political mascots of conquest. Jupiter, Mars, and Venus were no longer living myths, they were banners of imperial authority. To reject them was treason. And yet, Christianity spread. It carried something the old pagan religions lacked, exclusivity and universality. It offered salvation not just to one people, but to all. It promised eternal life, moral order, and cosmic meaning. The same ingredients every empire had tried to manufacture, now offered through faith alone. Rome at first tried to destroy it. Christians were tortured, executed, and erased from record. But persecution only strengthened the faith. The more Rome killed, the faster it grew. Within 3 centuries, the unthinkable happened. The empire that crucified Christ became the Empire of Christ. When Emperor Constantine converted, religion and power fused in a way the world had never seen. Monotheism had become the engine of empire. But the roots of that power, the idea that divine truth could justify rule, stretched back thousands of years, to Sumer's temples, to Egypt's priests, to Babylon's scribes. Monotheism didn't destroy the old gods. It absorbed their machinery and turned it into ideology. The ancient war of temples had simply found a new battlefield, the human conscience. From Akhenaten's heresy to the exile in Babylon, from Zoroaster's fire to Constantine's cross, the gods were not just worshipped. They were weaponized. The divine became political. The spiritual became strategic. And belief itself became the greatest empire of all, one that ruled from within. The world's first great conspiracy was no longer hidden in temples or sealed in stone. It was written into scripture, sung in hymns, whispered in prayers. It lived not outside us, but inside our minds. And soon it would reshape the entire map of the ancient world, as the empire of Rome, the faith of Christ, and the old gods of 1,000 nations collided in the final war of heaven and earth. In the next part, we follow the transformation of that collision, how Rome turned faith into law, religion into empire, and belief into the foundation of global power. Because when the gods finally chose sides, humanity paid the price. When Rome ruled the world, the gods ruled through Rome. Every victory, every province, every coin and monument was stamped with divine approval. Jupiter was king of the heavens, Mars the god of war, Venus the spirit of empire. Religion was not separate from politics, it was the language of it. The gods were the empire's propaganda, its invisible army. But in the shadows of those marble temples, something new was spreading, a religion of slaves, exiles, and outcasts, a faith that rejected all others. Christianity was born not in palaces, but in prisons. Its founder had been executed as a criminal by Roman law, yet his followers claimed he had conquered death itself. To the rulers of Rome, this was madness. To those beneath them, it was freedom. The old gods demanded sacrifice. The new God demanded faith. As Christianity grew, it challenged everything Rome stood for: hierarchy, wealth, and divine kingship. The Roman emperor was the Son of God, the mediator between heaven and earth. But the Christians proclaimed a different king, one who ruled not through armies, but through conscience. They refused to worship the emperor, refused to burn incense at his statues, refused to kneel to the symbols of Rome. To an empire built on unity through ritual, this was rebellion. And so, for centuries, Rome tried to crush them. Christians were burned, crucified, thrown to lions. Yet each execution became a sermon. Each martyr's death was another story of faith-defying power. Then, in the early 4th century, everything changed. A single battle, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, turned the world upside down. Emperor Constantine claimed that on the eve of the fight, he saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light, and the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol on their shields. He won the battle, and in victory, he converted. Overnight, Christianity transformed from outlaw cult to state religion. Constantine's genius was not in faith, but in strategy. He understood that belief could unify the empire more powerfully than fear. Rome had conquered the world with its legions. Now it would rule it through heaven. He convened councils to define doctrine, built basilicas where temples once stood, and made Sunday, the day of the sun god Sol Invictus, the day of rest official, day of rest and worship. Pagan festivals were repurposed, pagan sites rebranded. The empire did not abandon its gods, it absorbed them. And in doing so, Rome created something unprecedented, a fusion of church and state, crown and cross, power and piety. The divine right that once belonged to pharaohs and kings now belonged to emperors and bishops. The old pantheon was dismantled piece by piece. Temples to Jupiter, Venus, and Apollo were closed or converted. Statues of gods were defaced, their names cursed. Libraries that had preserved ancient philosophy were burned. The gods that had once ruled the Mediterranean were declared demons. It was not a war fought with swords, but with memory. Whoever controlled the story of heaven controlled the story of earth. Within a century, the Christian Church became the empire's moral engine. Emperors sought the Church's blessing. Kings bowed to bishops. The same formula that began in the ziggurats of Sumer, divine legitimacy, had evolved into a global system. Religion had triumphed not as faith, but as architecture. It structured society, justified law, and sanctified conquest. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the Church did not die with it. It inherited its skeleton, its cities, its language, its bureaucracy. The papacy became a throne in place of the emperors. The cross replaced the eagle as the symbol of authority. Europe was no longer united by armies. It was united by belief. But beneath that unity, the same ancient forces still stirred: politics, ambition, control. The church that preached peace became a kingdom that waged wars in the name of salvation. The Crusades began as pilgrimages and ended as invasions. Holy wars were declared not just against enemies of faith, but against heretics within it. Pagans were converted by sword and fire. The gods of the Old World, Celtic, Norse, Slavic, were erased as thoroughly as Marduk or Amun before them. The empire of belief had no borders. It was the final evolution of the first conspiracy, to make truth a monopoly. By the Middle Ages, religion had perfected the machinery of persuasion, ritual, art, architecture, fear. Cathedrals rose like mountains of stone and light, every arch and window designed to remind humanity of its place beneath heaven. The priest became the interpreter of reality, the gatekeeper between the seen and unseen. People no longer needed to understand the universe. They needed only to obey. Science, philosophy, and dissent, the same forces that once questioned the gods, were branded as heresy. To doubt was sin. To think was rebellion. The war that began between temples had become a war against thought itself. And yet, the old pattern never truly died. Each new empire learned to wrap itself in the language of heaven. Islam rose in the deserts of Arabia with the same conviction. One God, one truth, one destiny. The Ottoman sultans, the European monarchs, the popes and caliphs, all ruled through faith. Every banner bore divine justification. Every conquest was blessed. But strip away the names Yahweh, Allah, Christ, Ahura Mazda, Marduk, and the architecture is the same. From Sumer's ziggurats to Rome's basilicas to the skyscrapers of modern power, humanity has always built temples to its own order. The gods changed, but the system endured. What began as worship became hierarchy. What began as faith became authority. What began as the search for meaning became the management of minds. And through it all, the war never ended. It only changed shape. Today, the temples are no longer made of stone. They are made of media, ideology, and information. The gods are no longer carved in gold, but encoded in systems, economic, political, digital. But the principle remains. Control belief, and you control civilization. In every age, the same conspiracy breathes beneath the surface, the struggle to own the truth. When the first priest stood before the first fire and told his people that the gods had spoken, he began a story that would never stop being told. From that moment on, humanity divided its reality into sacred and profane, chosen and damned, truth and heresy. The war for heaven became the war for history. And perhaps, in the end, that is the secret the ancient world left us, that religion was never just about gods. It was about power, memory, and the architecture of control. The day religion went to war was not a single moment in time. It was the moment humanity learned to weaponize belief. And in every empire, every creed, every age since, that war has continued, silently, endlessly, shaping the destiny of the world beneath the illusion of faith. Because long before nations and armies there was already one empire, invisible, eternal, and undefeated, the empire of belief.